Hello and welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, my name is Adam Kosh.
And hi, my name is Nick Butcher.
And today we have an episode about the visual design, and specifically I guess we'll talk about the specs or red lines for the Cricut app that Rado put together, or the Cricut app design that Rado put together at, I think it was last Friday's App Clinic. Once we're done talking about that, we're going to jump into a couple of design details and recommendations on how to incorporate maps, specifically Google Maps, into your app. We have a bunch of interesting, fun slides there, and yeah, should be fun. So with that, let's get started with the Cricut app visual design. Nick, you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who didn't catch the App Clinic last week, Reto Meyer looked through his ideal kind of design, both in terms of kind of screen design as well as architecture, for creating an up-to-date kind of sports results app. So if you've missed it, I encourage you to check it out. It's a really great episode. Here on the screen we see what he put together. So while Rito spent a lot of time thinking about the functionality of the application, and I think he's done a pretty good job, he didn't, and in fact he stated he wasn't going to focus very much on the visual design. So we're going to pick up where he left off, pass over the banner, and have a look at some of the visuals that we can do here. So just quickly, the app on the left is a Cricut score tracking application. It has a panel at the top for tracking kind of in progress or kind of what's going on now games, and then it has a panel below which gives you a summary of the upcoming matches, which are kind of sorted by all kinds of intelligent signals as to if they're going to be relevant to the user. I'm not going to lay on it too thick, sorry Adam, about the Ashes result, because that just wouldn't be sporting of me to just pile the shame onto my poor Aussie colleagues. So we'll skip past that. So what we will look at, though, is some of the steps that we've taken to kind of address some of the visuals, and we're going to take it step by step and build it up. So one of the first things I looked at is the action bar. So one of my favorite components, one of the key navigational components in the Android platform. And I'm not sure if it was a conscious choice, but Rito picked this kind of blue color for the action bar. And one of my problems is this is one of the stock Android holo colors. And I find if an application kind of goes with this kind of like stock kind of blue, it makes it feel almost too stock in a way. It's almost like no kind of attention has been paid to it, or you're just kind of using an out-of-the-box component. So what I decided to do is, like, when I think of cricket, I kind of think of like green fields with players wearing white and a red ball, and that's the kind of palette I think to work with. So we instead reskinned it using this kind of grass green, I'm going to call it, as kind of our strong single accent color, which we're going to extend throughout the app later on, and then went for a monochrome icon, which works quite well. So again, picking up on that white and green, so we've got kind of a cricket bat icon there. And one thing we've done is we've actually themed the title text as well there. So picking up on the weight of the icon we've used, we've gone for a slightly heavier weight. So here we have Roboto bold condensed in a slightly larger font size, to again like pick up on the icon's weight, as well as we went with the italic theme there to kind of give it some kind of emotion, as well as adding some of the usual items you might find in the action bar. So Rito said he's going to use a navigation drawer, so we added the drawer affordance there, as well as adding search and overflow buttons. So step one, we had a little look at the action bar and showed it some visual love.
One of the things that I really like about this is specifically when you look at the way the icon is juxtaposed with the title, the weights of the glyphs and the font are actually not really similar, but they balance well with the thickness of the icon. So it's not like the icon is overpowering the title text or vice versa. It's actually very nicely balanced. So I think that bold condensed works really well here. Moving on.
Okay, step two. So after we picked an accent color, we then took a look at the rest of the palette in the application. So we extended the accent color throughout, so you can see it in the header and in the kind of page indicator we picked up on that same color. But also, the original used this kind of quite stark contrasting palette. So we had like a near black section at the top, and then a white section below. Very, very highly contrasting, and it kind of felt to me a little bit too visually contrasting. And as a side note, you want to be quite careful in your use of pure white, very, very pure white colors, just due to the technology most phones and tablets users have in their hands have these very, very bright screens. So using pure white can actually be kind of overpowering. So you want to reserve pure white for something which you want to draw attention to. You want to have some stark contrast, not so much for kind of a background panel. So what we've done here is we've kind of muted the color scheme down a little bit. So we've gone for these kind of off-white and kind of grey background, just to kind of make it a little easier on the eye, a little less contrasting.
Yeah, perfect. Moving on.
Yeah. So next step, we took a little look at the metrics. So there's a few things you can do to your applications to really easily make it easier to both scan and then to work out, what items belong together and which items are separate. So we applied the standard kind of 8 and 16 dip grid, which we commonly talk about here on a show, to this screen here. So you can see here we've just moved some of the kind of lines around, changed the margins and the spacings just to line up to this. It's majorly a 16 dip grid, and then for any minor kind of inter-list item kind of spacing, we've gone for 8 or sometimes even 4 dips. So basically we're using this kind of system rhythm, and it just makes it feel much easier to kind of like work out what belongs together and see how things should be spaced out. Not really related to the metrics here, but I also wanted to swap out the view page indicator here as well. So instead of I think before we had 4 dots with one of them colored in, instead I've gone for this kind of bar with a kind of colored in kind of almost like a scroll bar. It's a slightly more Android-y design, like having these angled flatter kind of lines rather than these dots, which is a bit of a hangover from kind of the iOS design guide.
And you'll see this view pager, or this pager indicator, I guess, in apps like the launcher, obviously, when you swipe between your different home screens, although it's a little hard to see there, as well as apps like Google Currents. So this is
Currents is a good example. I like that because it keeps the kind of bar persistent, whereas launcher kind of fades it out, which is kind of subtle and it's right for a home screen. But I think for something where you actually want to indicate that there's more content, this kind of present design works very well.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to point out is you mentioned, grouping, the ability for white space and margins to communicate relationships between elements and kind of group things together. And this is something that Alex Feyborg talks about a lot in a couple of his talks at Google I/O this year and I think last year as well. But basically, I think it's the Gestalt principle for for grouping. Placing items in close proximity naturally implies a grouping. So it helps here, I think, to communicate that these are individual elements. You almost can imagine like what would happen if you removed all the list item separators, right? Would the structure still be apparent? And I think in this case it would, given that there are ample margins. It also makes for a much better reading experience. As you're scrolling down, your eye can naturally land on an individual item, and once you actually see something interesting on an individual item, then you can kind of spend a little more time to explore it, rather than having to parse out which are the individual items in your list.
Great. Cool. And then I think the last step that we took on this screen here is to then apply some different typographical treatments to really tease out the information hierarchy. So in the previous design, all the information was there, but it was a little bit overwhelming to try and understand what was the most important, and nothing really jumped out at you. It kind of came across as kind of almost too dense as blocks of text. So what we've done here is we've used things like color and additionally different sizes and weights of the different text to kind of really tease out what is the most important. So I think the first thing I look at is the score obviously jumps out straight away at you, as well as the team names in the summary section. And then scanning down the upcoming list, it's very, very easy to quickly pass this list and find a game. You're going to look at this list and see, all right, that's the game I'm looking for, and then you can dive further down to find subsequent information. So by using these different text sizes, colors, and weights, it's really, I think, helps tease out the information hierarchy. So one of the things we didn't want to do is introduce too much complexity. So there is actually only 3 different font sizes if you include the score on the screen here. So it's not too busy. There's not too much going on. But by using these different colors and weights, we can really establish the hierarchy.
Yeah, I think it really makes a huge difference. And I think we've mentioned this before on the show, but I was actually looking at the two screens sort of from a distance because we've got a TV here to view the slides. And when you take a step back, you can really see what the difference that it makes. When you look at it from that distance, like you can see the titles very clearly, as opposed to the old screenshot where you just sort of see these blur sections of text which you can't really understand or comprehend very well.
One thing I want to pick up on is the use of kind of like the all caps style, which is fairly commonly used in Android. It's actually sometimes used for the like less important information, so it might seem kind of counterintuitive to when you might use capitals. You might think of it as a shouting, but quite commonly in Android we'll use a smaller text size with a kind of a lighter font color, less full value perhaps, coupled with the all cap style, and it really is this kind of like byline or strapline, and it's like the detailed information. I think this works quite well here for making this information seem like it is secondary information.
Yep. Just to give Reto some credit, I will say that the amount of information I think was accurate, was correct, right? I mean, and I will say that I'll caveat that I know nothing about Cricut, but one of the things that you should also think about in terms of typography and what to put on your screen is, are you showing too much at once? Are you showing too little? And I will say that I feel like Reto in the original design was actually showing the right amount of detail, the right amount of information. Again, caveating that I know nothing about Cricut, but I think that it's really, once you decide what to show and really kind of pick and choose, and again, you're on mobile, you don't want to cloud the user's context with too much stuff. You don't want to cloud their vision with too much unnecessary information. But once you decide what to show, you have to really think about how to show it, how to kind of portray the hierarchy, and I think that's where typography really can really help.
Yeah, the one thing that I wasn't quite sure about was, I think the second England flag on the left screen here, I think denotes on the other one, I think it denotes team currently bowling next to the number of overs bowled, and I found that kind of repetition of the visual a little bit kind of jarring, kind of a little bit unintuitive. So I swapped that out for a red dot, which is supposed to look a bit like a cricket ball, right? I thought that cleaned up the visuals and also made it feel a bit more balanced as well.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I remember making some minor tweaks here, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. Again, because I know nothing about Cricut. I guess it's another lesson. Know your users, know what you're designing before you design it. So. All
right, let's crack on. So the other thing with this exercise, other than cleaning up, it's showing how easy it is to perform a few tweaks on the information. I mean, Reto had done the hard work, like Roman says. The hard work is deciding what to show on screen and how much information to show. We just kind of provided a few visual tweaks to make it easier to scan and easier to consume. But another thing we want to do this exercise is just demonstrate how you would take such a mock and then communicate that design to a developer. So here's an example of the kind of technique we use in our applications here. This kind of like redlining technique where we'll actually overlay the document with these kind of red boxes and annotations, I guess, showing exactly what fonts, sizing, spacing, and going through and just really documenting everything, including there's an example of like the touch highlight, the opacity, the color, and so forth. So this is really kind of like the interface the designer has with a developer, right? This is the information a developer wants to know. They want to know. It's no good just giving them a PSD or something like that. They want to know things in dip sizes and kind of absolute colors and so on, so they don't have to go digging into a PSD file to find this information.
One of the things that I find really useful is when you're creating a responsive design or something where you're targeting multiple devices, rather than using, potentially, I mean, I don't know if this will actually work in practice, but it's definitely something that I've thought about before. Rather than using like 4 dip or 8 dip or 16 dip here, you could say like small or medium or large, and then have like a lookup table saying, on phone size devices, small is this size, medium is this size, large is this size. And then on, let's say, 7-inch devices, or once you have 600 dips of horizontal space, let's say, you start bumping those up. And having something like a lookup table, where basically like this is small, this is normal, this is large, and so on and so forth, that's actually really easy for developers to then take and map into dimensions files. So you can literally just take that lookup table and create XML files to specify the dimensions in those in those
Yeah, you
configurations.
get further than just the dimensions as well. Things like the text size, like I've specified it here as 18 SP, but that's kind of maps to what we have as this kind of text appearance medium, is this kind of standard text size. But that's 18 SP on some devices, but it could be larger on other devices. A device which you're more likely to hold further away, that could actually be a larger value. So rather than specifying anything, any number, I guess you could swap out for some kind of lookup value, right?
Yeah. All right, let's carry on to the navigation jar.
Yeah, so we didn't redo the whole application. We just looked at this one screen, but I did want to kind of pick up on something on the navigation drawer. So Rito's used it, and they kind of he's done a good subdivision of the different sections. But to me, there's a couple of problems with it. Firstly, the individual navigation kind of items felt a little bit insubstantial to me. This is your major navigation within the application, so I wanted it to feel a little bit weightier. And the other problem I felt was that there was no kind of idea of selection. So if you're currently on one of those screens, it should echo back to you that yes, this is where you are in the application. So this is what we did. Some very, very easy visual tweaks. We just changed the screen. So the first thing we did is we changed the line height of each item to pick up on the size of the action bar. So here on a phone-sized device, it's going to be 48 dips, but on a larger device, that might grow up to 56 dips, for example. But yeah, this echoes the height of the action bar, so it kind of falls into the natural rhythm of the screen, echoing the system components. We then kind of borrowed from the style we picked up for the screen title and used this kind of bold italic. It's not the condensed version here, just because I didn't feel like it kind of sat quite right. So this is just actually Roboto medium italic here. But yeah, I think these items kind of feel a bit weightier. And we didn't actually go through and create glyphs or find glyphs for this, but I feel like having some kind of iconography would also help with this sense of place.
Yeah. And then we have a spec for the navigation jar you put together, Nick?
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to call out a few items here. So this is how you might spec this. So one of the things we've done here is we followed our guidelines that a navigation drawer should be between 240 and 320 dips. So we've kind of called that out explicitly, so it's not going to grow too big. And we've called out things like the drop shadow to use, just to the right of the drawer, it has this very subtle kind of 3-dip drop shadow at 30% opacity. So just calling out all this kind of documentation that your developer is going to want to see. And you can see there actually kind of similar to how Roman said, if you can zoom in on the big square there over countries icon. Yeah, we specified the kind of the icon frame area. We called it 48 by 48 dip, but we've actually specified there in brackets it should be the same height as the action bar. So a developer is going to see that and know, oh right, yeah, okay, so I can see I should kind of assign that to the same height as the action bar. So on a different device, it might be a different size.
Yep. All right. Any parting thoughts for this design?
Not really. Like you say, I think Rachel did a great job of doing the hard work of actually working out the kind of information design, and we've just shown a few easy techniques in order to kind of communicate that better.
Yeah. I think Rato started with basic wireframes and, like you said, the information architecture, and then the process of taking that and creating medium to high fidelity visual design mocks is it's fairly simple. I think that you really start with the grid, you then move on to things like typography, color, and so on. But really once you have the wireframes, I think it becomes pretty easy to put together the visual design for it. Not to trivialize all the work we did, Nick, but. All right, so let's move on to maps. So Adam, you want to take away for maps?
Yeah, so let's talk about Google Maps for Android, the API version 2. So hopefully this doesn't need too much of an introduction. It was released last year with great fanfare as an upgrade to the original version of Maps, or MapView. It's a great API. If you have an app that takes advantage of or that needs to display content on a map, it's definitely something you should use. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a very powerful API that lets you sort of display these vector-based map components in your application. And the advantage of that is that, well, first of all, there's technical advantages to it, but from a visual perspective, the user can actually pan, tilt, rotate the camera as the user looks at the map very easily, and it's just a really immersive, interactive experience.
And they could see 3D building silhouettes, which is actually really good for providing extra context for, if you're looking for an apartment or looking for pizza places or something. It's actually, that extra bit of context can really go along.
It's a really neat feature. And I think it only happens when you zoom to a certain zoom level and in some cities, but it's really cool when you see it.
I think one of my favorite changes in Maps v2 is that I think in the Maps v1 there were some technical limitations about how many maps you could have in your application and so on and so forth. So if you heard developers pushing back about the designs about where you can and can't include a map, that's no longer the case. So v2 you can have kind of as many map objects and as big or small and make them animate and move as you like. So don't take that for an answer.
Yeah, I think you're also referring to map fragment there, which lets you use a map as sort of a portion of the screen rather than taking up the entire screen. So
yeah.
Definitely great updates in the V2 version of the Maps API. So in terms of interacting with the map, there's a few sort of standard controls that come with the API. Pictured here, you see the zoom controls, compass, and my location. Those are sort of fixed in various corners of the map if you enable them. The zoom controls is sort of always in the bottom right. Compass is in the top left, and it's actually not always visible. It's only visible when the user rotates or sort of moves the map away from the default angle or rotation. And then there's the My Location button, which is in the top right corner normally. And of course, these can all be toggled on and off. And you can also create your own UI controls if you want as well. These are just the standard ones. And then there's also some standard map gestures that you can use. So zooming in, obviously pinch zoom is a standard gesture for zooming in on the map or zooming out. Scrolling or panning just by touching the screen and dragging. Tilting is using 2 fingers to drag up and down. Rotating 2 fingers to rotate around. These are sort of pretty standard things that you've probably already experienced when using maps. So in terms of customizing the map, there's 2 main components that you can sort of customize. Well, there's a few others, but the main ones here are markers and info windows. So markers are the actual little markers that drop down on the map to indicate a location, and info windows are those little dialog boxes which pop up normally when you touch one of those markers. So obviously the default ones are kind of plain and boring. You should almost always customize these to fit your app appropriately. The info windows, they do support layouts, but they're very static. So for the developers out there, you'll find that you can't actually make sort of dynamic updates to those views. It really just draws it once, and then you're sort of stuck with that until you re-add them again. And I think we've got some more information.
And the one thing I wanted to mention was touch targets. So when we were designing the Google I/O app, which you see pictured here, we were actually thinking, can we have an info window that has like a primary target and then like a secondary see more target? And unfortunately, the current limitation is that no, the entire info window is a single touch target, and there's no real way to customize that. So there's no way to have like a button to the top right or like a separate kind of section in that info window that takes you elsewhere. So just plan for that and keep things simple. It does kind of help simplify the interaction model for the map, but it is a current limitation.
And this is a good example in the I/O app of customizing the info window. So you can see here the Android track is selected, and we've got this sort of nice green highlight faded there with the little Android icon in the top right.
And just for the developers in the audience, what basically happens is you can provide your own layout. What the map component will do is it'll take a snapshot of that layout. It'll actually draw it, lay it out, and so on. It'll take a snapshot and then use that bitmap snapshot to render the info window. So it's not actually like a text view and another text view and so on. It's really just like a snapshot. It's an image.
Basically calls draw, and then whatever the output is, it just displays that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Did you want to talk a bit about the visual design?
Yeah, so a couple of ideas for marker visual design. There's really 2 types of markers that you can have, and I guess you can use whatever shapes you want. If you have, let's say, a person on a map, obviously you probably want to use their avatar in there somewhere, and then that'll guide some of the shapes. But if it's just a very basic marker that indicates something, a couple of suggestions. The first is to try to use your brand accent color. So just as you would use your accent color in the action bar, or for like list section headers, or subtle accents throughout, definitely keep using that here in your marker images. And I think that we'll probably be able to share a PSD kind of template for this kind of thing at some point. But here's an example from the I/O app. We actually didn't use this one on the right here. But we did use this where basically the marker ends up just being white since we know the background is colored. And then we use the standard Google I/O purple or blue to red gradient as one of the items within the marker image. So it helps to kind of further that message of brand consistency throughout the app. Another thing I wanted to mention is around density. So if you have a lot of markers, this is one of the things that one of my pet peeves, I guess, when you open up like let's say a real estate search app or a pizza search app or whatever, and there's hundreds of results, and all you see are just these sea of markers. It's not that useful, right? You can no longer see the map. You kind of lose the whole point of having a map there. It's just kind of like a whole bunch of people standing in a crowd, and you can't really make out any one of them. So for those cases, you may want to use a smaller marker. And the point here is not to actually have a smaller touch target. The touch target should still really be kind of the same size, maybe a little smaller, like this or I guess all around this one, for example, this marker should be like a touch region that touching that actually triggers it. But the idea here is that it doesn't really matter if you accidentally click the wrong one. What the user would do is be able to zoom in to see more information about that area. And once the markers, these smaller markers are well separated out, then there will be kind of no ambiguity in terms of which one you clicked. So the idea is use smaller markers purely for the purpose of seeing the map underneath. Because like we said before, actually like what was said in one of the slides there was the map is, or actually no, later on, the map is the UI, right? Like the whole context, the whole interface for the user is the map. It's the geographic context. So you don't want to obscure that with too many markers.
And speaking of that, if the map's not going to provide the clustering kind of algorithm for you, because we leave that to you, because you probably know more about the information and how to cluster yourself. But if you want to have an example of how we do clustering, there's a great blog post called Too Many Markers from the Google Maps team describing how we do clustering. So for developers out there who want to implement that, Google for Too Many Markers.
Cool.
All right,
moving on.
So changing the view, as I mentioned before, you've got a lot of control around how the sort of user is viewing, the perspective the user is viewing the map, basically the camera angle that the user is viewing the map on. And actually the Maps API makes it really, really easy to animate the camera between locations. Basically animate the location, zoom, bearing, and tilt, all of these different things. And actually it does it by just setting an extra flag. It will animate between two locations. And this is really useful for sort of giving the user a sort of way of illustrating the difference between two locations. So, for example, if you're viewing something in New York and you want to jump across to London, the map will very quickly zoom out, swing across to London, and sort of give you this very easy mental spatial idea that you've moved a very long distance across the map. And I guess one point to mention that is that you don't need to always pan the map if there's tons of different info windows around. So that will mean that the touch targets where the user's trying to touch the map will keep shifting from underneath them. So in those particular cases, you may want to sort of minimize the amount that the map moves around. But in most other cases, it can be useful to show these animations between locations.
Yeah, and I think with the API, there's no automatic panning behavior. So you can definitely customize, what happens when you touch something. But really, that point I can't mention it enough. It's the one of my other pet peeves I'd say is when you touch like a marker that's kind of like just off center, and then it recenters the whole thing, and like everything else shifts around underneath you. And I mean, like obviously the animation helps maintain that context, but it would still just be much better if you just kind of kept things in place, only moving the map as much as you need just to show the content.
Yeah, so if you tap the marker like maybe at the edge of the screen, then you may want to pan the map down. But if as Roman's saying, it's just off center, it may not make sense.
Yeah. All right, let's speed through since we're running late.
Okay, the most important slides will have no time on. But anyway, so a full screen map or a large map. The reason why I say large map here is just because if you're on a larger screen device, it may not actually be a full screen map. It may sort of be taking up the majority of the screen, but not all of the screen. So in this particular case, the map is really the interface here. You should really allow panning, tilting, zooming, rotating. Not allowing those is kind of unexpected to the user. They sort of be expecting to be able to do all of those things. And of course, you should be minimizing UI distraction. Now, one thing that we've recommended in the past is using the action bar overlay mode, so adding some transparency there to the action bar. And this is actually from one of our first episodes of Android Design in Action that we did a very long while back now. I will note that it's a great thing that you can enable if possible. There is a minor issue with it from a technical perspective, in that the Maps API will actually show the UI controls underneath the action bar potentially, because it doesn't actually relay out those UI controls in some cases when you engage the overlay mode. So it's maybe not appropriate at the moment for all applications. Maybe if you're using custom UI controls, it could work. But definitely, if you can enable it, it's a really neat feature to sort of make the map feel more immersive.
Yeah.
All right, should we just zoom through?
Yeah, let's fly through. Yeah.
Okay, so embedded map. So now the map is not full screen anymore, and what's written here, the map is really the context here. So it's just trying to give some context around the information on the rest of the screen. In this case, you should really be removing or minimizing the UI controls. You don't really need to have the zoom buttons. The user's probably not going to be doing two-fingered gestures in that tiny little space. This is an example from Foursquare, by the way. And the nice thing that Foursquare actually does here is if you tap on the map, a single press, it actually expands the map out to the full screen and sort of switches back to that full screen map mode that I was talking about before. And then the last thing is there is a sort of, you could potentially switch using static maps if you're using embedded maps. So not really having any interaction or removing some of that dynamic feel from the maps until you tap on it and maybe be taken to a full screen map. Anything else there, guys? I know we're zooming through really quickly.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Those are.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is to also take a look at the kind of the updates to the Google Maps application, because I think that's a phenomenal job of doing some of the things Roman was talking about, like keeping the kind of interface stable, but having easy interaction to kind of move between different pins and stuff. So I think that's a great example as well.
Yep, cool. All right.
Design news, and
quickly.
let's try to do this in a minute. First, if you are in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Mountain View, whatever, there's an Android designers meetup coming up. Check out this URL here to meetup.com and join. I think the first event is happening next week, August 6th.
And if anybody wants to do something similar in London, then ping me, because I wouldn't mind starting something like this.
Yes. Oh, and we have a similar New York Android designers meetup. I don't think we have the next one planned yet, but sometime in August, hopefully. So, all right. Next, so one thing I really wanted to point out is that we've been posting a lot of pro tips on the Plus Android Developers Google Plus page. We have a bunch of Android development pro tips, but also a bunch of Android design pro tips. So this one here is specifically about the new Nexus 7 that was launched last week. And specifically some design details there. Basically, long story short, you have already designed for the new Nexus 7. There's no extra work to do. It's basically the same dip resolution as the old Nexus 7, just with a higher density. So everything should just work. But yeah.
And oh my God, it's beautiful. Everything's so sharp.
Yes, it is. It is a gorgeous screen. And lastly, one of the things that was new in Android 4.3 is this new kind of optical bounds feature. So basically, if before your 9 patches had extra spacing around there to account for things like drop shadows and glows and such, and that caused your UI elements to not really visually line up. And Kirill Grachnikov did a fabulous blog post about this specific problem and how they address this in the Google Play Store. But if you are having this problem and you want to address it, as of Android 4.3, there's a new feature called kind of optical bounds in 9 patches. So basically, in your 9 patches, you have these extra red markings to indicate that this should be the kind of negative margins that you should shift the UI element to, so that the left visual edge or the left optical edge aligns with other items in that along that edge. So it's new in Android 4.3. You kind of go from kind of a sloppy layout here on the left to something a little more clean and well aligned on the right, and pretty easy to do. Yeah, I think that's all the time we have today. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I think I don't know what we're doing next week or when our next show will be, but see you soon. I'm your host Roman Nurek.
See you guys, Adam Kosh.
Bye, Nick Witcher.
Adios, folks.